Scut is a proud sponsor of the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler. Scut Ceramic Products has been manufacturing equipment for potters since 1953. Scut's reputation as a pioneer in innovative kiln design continues with the fourth generation of this family-owned business. Their KilnMaster touchscreen controller offers a sleek, smartphone-like interface that is both intuitive and packed with powerful tools that allow potters to easily program, diagnose, and remotely monitor their kilns. With 5 dedicated kiln technicians on staff and the most comprehensive network of distributors across the globe, you can rest assured that Scut will be there for you before and after the sale. For more information on their line of kilns, visit scut.com. This episode is also sponsored by the Poquoson Art School of Fine Craft. Poquoson is a full-service art center in Columbia, North Carolina, offering interactive online workshops and a 5-month spring residency where you can focus on your creative practice. To learn more about these opportunities, visit poquosonarts.org. Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 395 of the podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. Today on the show, I talk with Greg Payce. You'll recognize him from just a few episodes back where he appeared with Katrina Chater in a live episode. In this interview, we do a deep dive into his career and work and talk about his signature vessels, which often harness the negative space in between the vessel to create another image. We also talk about his explorations of photography and video and how he remediates ceramic objects into other images. If you'd like to see examples of his work, you can follow him on Instagram under Greg Payce. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. We're going to jump around in terms of your work because you've had a 50-year career, so
Yeah.
you've made so much that I think I'm just going to jump in, talk about something, and then jump out and go to a different era.
Sure.
But there's a piece you made about Voltaire, or at least the negative space between the two vessels was Voltaire's face, or him in silhouette, and then behind it you put ceramic objects from different cultures, and then you photograph that. And I think that this is a good example of the way you approach work, which is to make ceramic objects that are in proximity to other objects, and then the meaning between all of that is the work you're making. So you're kind of asking questions through positioning objects. So can you talk about that work? I think I wrote down the name of it, and I'm blanking it. It references Voltaire's...
Called On the Customs and the Spirit of the Nations.
Yes, that.
Okay. I'll start it with the context. Back in 2008, there was a group of us that went and did a residency in an old chateau, like the real thing in France, but it was not kept up. It's probably like most of them are. They're giant things that need repair. And it was quite a place built in the early 1700s. And we were supposed to do, we did a residency around sort of rifling through the place and sort of, connecting with each other and with the context there to make work. Now, lots of people made work in situ, but it's pretty hard to make ceramics in a small town in France with no stuff. So I took a lot of information back and I made that piece. And one of the reasons I made that was because they had an astounding book collection up there that if somebody stole it, they'd be a billionaire. And they had the complete works of Voltaire, and I thought that was very interesting. And he's kind of, in my view, one of the major Enlightenment figures in the French culture at the time. And the other thing that's cool about him is he has a easily recognizable profile. It's like you might actually know who that is because you've seen it in art history books, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what I wanted to do was to make some vases with his profile in between. And then what I did with that is I took that into my studio and I started to make something called lenticular images, which are basically wiggle pictures. You used to get them postcards of New York and stuff where everything moves, right? And now there's a really high tech way of making all those things. And I worked with a software guy in Montreal, and we, actualized all these things. But that particular piece, what I wanted to do was to sort of talk about things he touches upon in this treatise, which is kind of one of the first multicultural Western documents where people in other lands were considered persons and things like that. So it was a big shift, and I would say arguably the beginnings of multiculturalism. So what I wanted to do was have that window of Voltaire and certain things behind it that you could muse about the relationship between the images and the objects. Now, there's an American writer, Stephen, I can't remember his last name, really, really good science writer, wrote about the concept of the adjacent present, which means, and I watched a Nick Cave film last night, and he talks about the same thing. It's like when you put one thing next to another, he talked about contrapositioning and things like that, but you automatically have to somehow come to terms with the relationship of those objects or those images or objects or those ideas or those words. So that's kind of the strategy I use there. I'm not trying to really get across a message or anything like that. I'm just trying to get people to kind of get drawn in by the illusion of those lenticular photographs and, the image of this guy and whatever is behind him. So, and I really like the relationship between images and objects. And a lot of people don't think about it this way, but you've never seen anything but an image of my work, right? So the images are really, really critical in what I do. There's all kinds of differences between images and objects. I don't know if you know the ceramist Paul Mathieu.
I do, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's written a lot on this, and I think it's really, really interesting stuff. And most sculptors don't think about, images and objects as being very different things with different potentials. But I try to kind of draw out that relationship in some of that installation work that I do, and particularly that one. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I wanted to get more into that difference between the space between an image and an object, even if the image is of that object. So what I'm thinking about is how does the work when you're making it, for instance, the vases that form Voltaire's silhouette, how do those become revolutionized? Or I think the word is remediated, which I've seen people as they write about that, when they become the photo. Like, how does the content of the work change in the photo that's not there in the objects when they're sitting in front of you, which is what you're working on?
I've made those lenticular photographs. Okay, being able to use photographic media to do all the photography, the software that breaks down the image, and the technology of a lenticular screen to be able to animate that is something that is completely different than the objects themselves in my studio in the photo booth. I can put that in a crate and send it to Europe for way less than if I tried to send the other things there. So it has different kind of display potential. People read it differently because of the materials it's made of. It can be put into different areas. Another example is some of these works that I've made them out of turned metal as well. And I have a piece in the Calgary airport right by the baggage where people have all their baggage carts and stuff, and ceramics just would not work there. But this thing is made out of bronze, so it has the potential of reaching a different audience. And people, when they touch metal, it's different than touching ceramic. There's a whole sort of a baggage of ideological and physical things that happen when you change materials. So it's also a way of referring to things and talking about them. And I'm going to make a controversial statement, and you can disagree with me. But I would argue that those lenticular photographs actually are ceramics, even though they aren't made of ceramics, because they're about ceramics. And that's really all they're about. So it just kind of gives you a chance to sort of play around in that realm of things, rather than just simply an embrace of the material and the potentials of that material, like ceramics.
Well, what I love about this is I thought I was going to ask you this deep conceptual question, and your answer was very practical.
Well, yeah.
I appreciate that, because I do think that practical ideas often are the starting point for more conceptual things. So actually, I want to back up in your career and go back to the first vases that you made to talk about how you isolated the silhouette or the space between as being the thing you wanted to focus on. So can you talk about that era? I think it was mid-90s, 95?
Yeah, late 90s, I think I was starting to make things like that. I made a sort of a whole series of things. And that's kind of when all that stuff caught fire, and it was fun. It was like the whole area to explore. One of the things I got when I went out to graduate school in Nova Scotia was a whole big awareness, a sudden awareness of the history of ceramics and the sort of the history of the material culture and the social history of ceramics in world history. And now I'm blanking here. What was I talking about?
How you got to the vases with the silhouette.
Yes.
So I think you were talking about how you got interested in ceramic history itself.
Yeah, and that I really got interested in it. So I started to look at everything in terms of its relationship to other periods and cultures, and took a lot of inspiration from decoration and form and all of those kinds of things. And I made some pieces based on Italian albarelli with the the space in between, so you could slide your fingers in to pull them off the shelf. And I thought, hey, that's an interesting thing. We've got this space that goes all the way along. And the first piece I did was actually called 17 Albareos. And I had a series of tiles behind this row of apothecary jars, and it's just 17 because that's how many I made. And as you walked along, I animated this drop of water falling on a tile. So if you walked along, it became like a zoetrope, right? And I always have to learn how to make my ideas because the forms, as you can see, get quite complicated. So I spend a lot of really, really boring time making these things. It's so different than the pleasure of throwing a pot. The end point is what you want, and you kind of go through this thing to get there. But I had to get good at throwing, and I had to get good at figuring out how to make templates and all of that sort of stuff. And that sort of graduated into pots between ceramic forms. And then it sort of graduated into figures. And then I started to animate the figures. But another thing that I was looking at that made me think too was Sèvres garnitures, because they're these wonderful things. And the big difference between what those artists were doing and what I'm doing is they're all about the positive form. And I started to really look at the spaces between them. And I thought, wow, if they'd ever thought of that, could you imagine what those people could have done? Technically, I could never reproduce a Sèvres work. The technology at that time was just astounding. So, but that's sort of what the genesis came. And then later on, I sort of took that into larger scales and other materials and things like that.
So with the albareo, like you were talking about, that sort of understanding that form, that's a pharmacy jar that would go up on a shelf lining a an older pharmacy. So the spaces in between were for someone to put their hand, so you could grab it, but they could be right beside each other without it being a problem.
And I think that is such a cool thing. Somebody figured out that when you line up a row of jars, you don't want to push them apart, but you can just reach in and grab them. It was this ultimate practical solution. And you can take that and use it as an inspiration for something completely different.
And in a way, I think if you were in those pharmacies back in the day, you would have seen decoration behind them, because if those walls had wallpaper behind them, you would have or both of us would have been able to go, oh, right, the space between. But what's funny is, as obvious as that is in the pharmacy context, in my mind, it's not obvious in the ceramic context. Like you're one of the only people I've seen that you have worked with the idea of negative space for years and years and years. Like this has been something you've returned to over and over and over. So can you talk about sort of discovering that this was a region of ideas that you wanted to keep working with?
I just thought there is such an interesting, I would say, and you can argue with this if you like, that pottery forms are abstract human sculpture. Some of the earliest ones, and then we name all the parts after bodies. And when you start making bodies in between, a magical thing can happen, and it can go anywhere you want it to. So I don't think I'm done yet. I'm not pushing things out as much as I did when I was an academic, but I still think about it a lot. And I have a project I'm currently working on with a bright young professor at AU Arts, and we're figuring out how to make 3D print these things so that when you have two of them moving, the figure in between starts doing all kinds of things. So you can actually animate the animation even more. So I don't think it's over yet, but I think it's going to go into other technology. There'll still be ceramics, but I think it's all based on that. I don't feel like I'm leaving anything behind. I think I'm actually making the discourse richer by doing all of these kinds of things. A lot of pots were based on metal forms to begin with. Ceramics didn't invent all of those forms. A lot of the really tight ones were metal, and then the potters figured out how to do that. So
I love that history. The potters were making cheaper alternatives because the clay was cheaper than the metal.
Pretty much. It was interesting. The first time I went to China, it was in the mid-90s, and when Deng Xiaoping had just sort of opened things up, and people were selling things on the street. They were selling plastic, and all the plastic forms were imitating all of the ceramic forms. So strange remediation thing again. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to think about the process of this. You mentioned you use templates, and for the people that are listening that might not be following what the objects look like, I want people to just Google your name, because once they see the work, they're going to understand what we're talking about. But can you talk about how you use a template to make the vase, which then makes the silhouette?
Okay. The inspiration for the templates comes from watching Bruce Cochran make foot rims for his big earthenware things that he was doing in the 90s. And I thought, wow, that's a cool tool. It's actually a form of mold making. But then I started making more elaborate ones that I sort of would, first of all, I made them out of old lithographic plates, sheet metal, and would screw them onto wooden things and sort of push them up against clay, and I had to figure all that out. The first ones were clumsy, and all the people had really wide legs, and I had to figure out how to up the game a little bit. So I started later on, maybe a couple of years later, using it comes by different names. Formica, it's basically the countertop that goes on top of things, and I have a scroll saw, and I cut out those forms. But as we know, clay shrinks when it dries, and these things are on the wheel sometimes all day for a really complicated one. So things are drying and shrinking. And if you have one template, every time you pull it over, you're going to start mucking up what you did before because it shrank. So I have a system where I have a template sort of layered on top of each other. So I'll have the bottom section in, and when that's done, I'll unscrew it and then add the next one up. And meanwhile, there's enough space for the wheel to turn without destroying what I've already made. And I've gotten really good, and the technology has gotten really good with, what are they called? They're like heat guns. Now you can get them to go to exact temperatures and things now. So I use those a lot, and I figured out how to make that work. At first I used to crack things and all of that sort of stuff, but now it's a part of the whole process. And I use clays that don't move. Some clays kind of relax. And I used to put malachite in my earthenware so that it wouldn't do that, molachite. And then I discovered this Southern Ice clay out of Australia, which is perfectly white and has enough tooth to it so that it'll go up. It's actually kind of a throwable bone china. It'll go up to cone 10, but I stop around cone 6, just at the point it's going to start to move. Because if I high fire these things, if things move in the kiln way more than people think they do. If you're trying to match top lips, yeah.
What also makes me think about these templates as ribs, like
they're essentially a rib. Yeah.
But when you're using a rib, you have to mediate friction. And when you hold a rib up against the side, or in your case, a template, sometimes you get this chattering if something is, too dry. So on a very practical potter level, how have you been able to do these very complex things without that happening?
The edge of the template is very, very critical. And I bought templates, and I'm always a little disappointed because they have this sharp edge, like, a square edge to them. And the secret is to round things out. So if you looked at a micro photograph of the edge of my rib, it would come out in a shape that there's nothing square to tear it. And also the lubrication process. And I used to splash water all over everything, make a big mess. And finally I got it down to, I used those little yellow sponges, and I fill them with water, and I drag them just before the template. And the template has to be square right on. It can't be too far one way or the other way. It has to be in the exact right position. And I use water to lubricate it. And you have to be really careful about that, because I've ripped lots of them apart by not having enough water at the right time. So it's one of those, I really had to teach myself a really arduous process, and I happened to get good at it to make these things.
Well, I think it shows that you've had a really long time of focusing on the technical skill to then make your ideas come through. Because I think when people see the work, potters are probably thinking, wow, that's amazing, because you're able to do that. But I think people that are artists, or even that are not artists, that just go to museums to see your work, what they're thinking about is the images between. So skill is kind of what's the foundation to make that happen.
Yeah, and I'm not one of these people that has a hierarchy with these things. The skill is as important as the so-called concepts in my work. I'm critical of conceptual art. I think this is going to sound bad, but I think a lot of it's bogus. Sorry. Now that I'm not an academic anymore, I don't have to sort of be a slave to all of that stuff. It's another way of establishing hierarchies. And I don't think the intellect is more important than the hands. I really don't. I think both are really important. And you can I obviously have trained my hands to do certain things that, it takes a long time to be able to do. And it's no small thing, just as like I've trained my mind to think about things as I've moved along. And that sort of drives what I do with my hands. So
before, you were talking about one of those first works where it was 17 arboreos with the image behind it, or it was an animation of a water drop. When you say animation in that era of your work, it's actually just the person being able to walk past. It's not like a video animation, which reminds me a lot of, like, if you go to the boardwalk, for instance, I live in New Jersey close to the beach, and there's a boardwalk, and little kids will always, put a quarter in the little thing, and it will basically spin. I don't know what they're called, but it's a circle with an image behind it, and it makes a moving image of whatever you're doing. And that, to me, is like so similar to the work that you make, the concept of animating something through repeating the image over and over again in a slightly different position. And it's funny, it seems so early 19th century, but it's still so cool. Like my nephew and niece, like if I buy them a flip book, which is essentially the same idea, they will be as interested today as in the early 1900s when people were first figuring this out.
Well, I sort of forgot somebody in the whole thing. My bridge photographs. A lot of the things that I do are actually taken directly from that, and those were mid 1800s, I think, really, really early. That was a giant, huge discovery that movies came. So many things came after that. It's a huge, important thing that happened there. Being able to dissect how things move and to be able to make them move again.
Yeah, and I think isn't one of those images a horse, like a horse that's trotting? Yep, and you see it in movement. But the reason I'm bringing this up is when is the first time you saw this? Like, do you remember as a child seeing this type of moving image?
Oh, I really remember early lenticular pictures, and I've always, been very interested in animation, and I made zoetropes and things like that before I ever sort of did that. I've also been really, really interested in illusion. And I think that is going to, it comes from a strange source, but Bridget Riley back when I was young in the 60s and 70s, she was like doing this wild optical art painting stuff. And it made certain things happen visually when you looked at it. And I just thought, wow, illusion is a really interesting way to, catch people's eye and make them look at things and try to think about what they're seeing.
And there's this moment in illusions where you see it for the first time, whether it's, in your work, the image behind, or whether it's a magician doing a trick. It's like your brain, you're so confused, you can't figure out what you're seeing. And then there's this moment of realization where you do understand what you're seeing. And there was someone that was writing, I was reading the catalog for your anthology exhibition in 2017, and this was Diana Sherlock writing about this, and she talked about this sense of vertigo that can happen when people look at something and then their brain is trying to figure out what they're seeing, but if the image is moving, it's also confusing. And I think that's kind of an iteration of your work as well, like when the images, or in the case of the objects, aren't static anymore, once you start them moving, you're really like confusing the people, but you're also giving them that moment, that aha moment once they figure it out.
There's so much art out there, and everybody's fighting to get everybody to look at what they're doing. And that you call the aha moment, that is, if you want to get someone to think about what you've done, that's a great strategy, because you've got them, they're okay. And they've figured it out. You haven't told them. There's a person in between there. And then they don't always start to think, but I really hope that they consider the relationship between the space between to the things that make the space between. And there's a real danger of the pots becoming, not anything in this. And I always try to keep them as, real, they're real pots. You could put flowers in them if you want. And quite often I will allude to things with the decoration or the surfacing that I'll put on them to bring out certain things too. So I'm trying to keep that relationship going.
Let's talk about surface. The templates kind of scrape the surface, but then you're often either banding on color, or sometimes the vases are all one color, like there's been slip that's been applied. So can you talk about, like, as an early potter, in your art school days as an early ceramic artist, how did you figure out how to not overdo the surface? Because a lot of times when I'm looking, the form will have lots of ins and outs, but the surface is relatively crisp and clear because it has to be for that silhouette to be seen in between them.
If you take a look at what I do, it's very rarely the vase that describes the front is painted. It's always the one behind, because you have a much smoother profile on the back than you do on the front. And the front is the one that gives identity and gender. Back, it's quite interesting, because one of the things I've done is the piece that's going over to England is a large piece. Is the person changes sexes over the course of this garniture. So you can really sort of play around with the back and the front. But it's all, I only tarred up the back sides, and some of that is just good old simultaneous contrast again. Blue and orange, and green and red, and purple and yellow, and things to kind of spark, spark some sort of a visual investigation. I don't use a lot of pastels.
Because you don't like them, or the contrast isn't high enough?
The contrast isn't high enough. There's one I just did called Venus, which is really quite nice, and it's really a pale pastel back. But usually I'm looking for more contrast to kind of bring the people to see the things and then discover what the things are doing. And if I want to establish a narrative, I'll quite often do all the fronts black or white, and then the backs. I did a piece where a male ages, and I was doing these in earthenware then. I started off on left with light banding, and it gradually went to really dark banding at the end. So it's sort of, it connotes a passage of time, or something like that. Something is happening. Yeah.
If these are in a gallery space where people need to walk along to be able to see this transition, it's interesting to think about the person moving being time. Like they are in time in the gallery moving, and also seeing this person age in time. It makes me think about, and one thing I wanted to talk to you about is gallery space. Like if you figured out that, for instance, you can't show a solo show in a gallery that's smaller than, I don't know, like a 10 by 20 space, because if these objects are too close together, it doesn't work. Like the objects need some space to breathe, not the collections. Like the collections are close together, the garnitures. But then if you had that right beside another one, it doesn't work.
No.
Can you talk about display in a bigger show like that? How do you pull that off?
It's very interesting because so unlike most ceramics people, bless their hearts, my work is already ready months before the exhibition usually. And I'm plotting sort of, I get maps of the gallery. And when I did the shows in Berlin a year and a half ago, I had everything planned long before the show set up, just because I know what sight lines you need, and you can't have things in front of each other. And I used to cram a lot of stuff into a room, and now I tend to have less and get more people around. And the openings are the wrong time to see them because there's too many people there. So
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think about that too. When I see your work, the pictures of it that I resonate the most with are when they're in empty galleries and you're only seeing that work with well lit from above or in front.
But the lighting is way more critical than most people think too. And it's like a counterintuitive thing. I always have to really explain it to technicians if I'm not going to be there, is lighting these things from the front just produces a bunch of confusing shadows, because those forms cast the shadows of the negative space on the wall at a really weird angle. So it destroys the illusion. So now what I do is I make shelves that are usually at least 12 inches deep and really well braced, and the pots themselves are up at the edge of the shelf towards the audience. And then I shoot a spotlight down direct, like the juncture between the wall and the ceiling, right down behind, and light the wall evenly behind, and then that pops the images out. And yeah, that's how you light the works. You don't shine any lights on them. And I've seen some disasters of people trying to do that. You cause more problems the more light you try to put on. So,
well, it makes sense. It's the clarity of light makes the clarity of image.
Yeah, and again, the images are so important in this. And even in my studio, I have a dedicated photo setup. I have one of those soft boxes, and I have a giant, big old ping pong table that I do most things on. But the one half of it has this light box over it, and I set up this photo studio to do all of these things. I shot all the lenticular photographs at home too, and I had to make a big turntable and turn this thing half a degree 24 times. And so a lot of research comes from actually making the objects and then photographing them. I'm not a real confident computer guy, and I'm sure you could figure some of this stuff out if you took long enough. But me to have some objects in space that I can play around with and photograph them gives me new ideas, and new pieces come from that. So it's a very interesting thing to have to make a thing before you can make another thing.
Well, it goes back to this idea of remediation, like that you make the object, and then a lot of times I've noticed you'll have a show of those objects or of the vases, and that will be one work. And then maybe 5 years later, 4 years later, sometime later, then there's that same work is then reimagined, through photography. So how long do you live with work in your own studio before new ideas hit? I mean, I know this is probably different depending on the idea, but do you have any sense of how long it takes for a new idea to form, even if it's the objects you previously made?
Well, I have a box of ideas. I don't do drawings that you could sell, put on the wall, but I do a lot of drawings, and a lot of it for years was on 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper. And when I'm in there, listening to the music and doing things, I'll think of an idea and I'll just write it down, and it goes in the box of ideas. So a lot of things sort of build up from periodically going back and looking through that. And sometimes I'll see a pattern or, so if something pops into my head, it just goes there. But I have way, way more ideas than I will ever get a chance to make. And right now, I have a couple of lists here on some stickies of some things that I would like to do. And some of them are really hard and they're going to take a lot of work. And some of them are more straightforward. I'll pick from that. But I always have more ideas than I can ever execute. So I'm just trying to pick the best ones, and ones that make sense with other things that I've done too. Because I kind of see my career as a process. I see myself as a continuation of, Candler, who was, doing all that sort of stuff at Meissen and got really good at it. And look what happened with things after that. I'm just part of that whole continuum. That's my job.
Well, I wanted to ask you about where ideas come from, because you had this great quote in your artist statement. I do not believe that ideas pop out of the void and come into our heads. I believe that most of our making is a distillation or a coming to terms where the pile of the things from our experience and its relationship to contemporary ideas and contexts. Yeah. And when I hear that, what I hear is someone who's self-aware. Because if the ideas aren't coming from out here, they have to be distilled in your mind. So can you talk about this intuitive process, like where these ideas sort of manifest from little ideas to big ideas that eventually go into the show, a show?
Yeah, I mean, daydreaming is way, way underrated. People that don't daydream probably aren't good artists. You have to sort of let your mind wander. And I used to hang with a lot of philosophers back in the 80s. And there was one fellow named Bob Scott that talked to me. He was a logician, I guess, and he talked about you always think of something as being logical or illogical, but that's another binary, and we all know binaries are just the way humans come to terms with things. There's also something that's sort of more in the middle of all that called alogical, which is not really, you couldn't prove it in the theorem, but wouldn't it be cool if? And I think a lot of art operates in that territory. That, at least what I do. And people will not agree with me, but I'm always trying to kind of construct. It's a little bit like my work. It's the space between two ideas. There's always something in there. What can you imagine that could be? And it's new territory. It always is new territory, and it prevents you from being one of these people that sort of reproduces what other people do, because you're always coming up with some hybridization of things that you've done before. And every time you do that, it becomes more personal and more unique and sort of more unseen, or it hasn't been seen before. So,
well, we've talked about photos and the role of that becoming the work, like when a lenticular photograph is the work that's displayed. But I wanted to talk about videos, because that's kind of a whole nother thing. Once the images you make are moving, then there's lots and lots of possibilities. So there's a few works that, you'll have, let's say you have a square room and you have one video shooting on one wall, one video shooting on the other wall. So the person walks in and then they turn around and they're seeing it's still videos of your work, but the person's orientation to what's happening in front of them and behind them, it's different in a video than it is in a photo. Because in a photo, you're looking at the photo. Like there's no behind you when you're looking at a photo, depending on the exhibition, I guess. But can you talk about videos and how that affects all of this?
Okay. Videos started probably in the mid 2000s, I guess. And what I realized is that I had a piece, it was like 46 12-inch high ceramic things where a woman ages and then gets young and then ages again, so that there's this sort of seriality to it, and you were sort of meant to walk around it. It was in a kind of a crescent form. But what I started to do those things was to put them on a turntable. And you're going to love this. The technology was a piece of string that the turntable was on a Shimpo banding wheel, and then it went over to my potter's wheel. It was on another little thing glued to my potter's wheel, and I controlled the speed with my wheel, which is a total in joke, but it makes me really happy. Anyways, I would get these things moving, and then I would put a video camera in front. And then I realized that if I got a digital projector and went a little lower, I could project images on these things while they were moving. So the piece that you're referring to was, I can't remember the name of them now, but it was a series of those where I basically, I take a lot of pictures in museums, and I have just billions of those. So I would project, pictures of Mexican Talavera that faded in and out on some. And then there was another one called Europa, which was all sort of European decoration. So it was basically an homage to likely the women that did all the painting on these works that they made, but I'm just using photography to sort of simulate that technology onto my work. And the other thing about remediation is scale. I mean, those pieces were 12 inches high. And when you project them onto the wall, they become like 12 feet high. So that affects people differently than something small. Scale always affects how you view something. So, but then things have quite evolved. The show that I had in Berlin, I started making these forms much bigger, and they're very, very detailed. And now I can, with HD and the different aspect ratios, I've got some beautiful videos of, just pieces turning, and it's all about that figure in the space changing and layering and moving over top of each other. So again, it's a byproduct of what I make. And one of the ways to sort of think about what I do is when I'm making ceramics, I like to think of them as characters. What am I going to do with these things next? Because they always have at least a still photography life, and some of them show up in videos. And then some of them even harken back. I've used pieces, from 20 years before in those lenticular series behind them. So I'll recycle things that I have. I always keep my best work unless the museum wants it. So I'm quite careful about getting the good stuff in places where somebody's going to see it after I'm gone, right? So
one of my professors used to say that it's good if your work can work for you. So meaning it can be shown a couple times. If you sell it really quick, then no one will see it unless it's in a museum.
Yeah. And I like to get things out there. I don't have any kids, and so it's like, it's my contribution. And I took the research aspect of my academic job quite seriously. So did my wife, Laura. We both worked really, really hard on our practices. And I just want to make sure that gets doesn't just end up in a dumpster somewhere. So you never know. Once something leaves your studio, you don't know what's going to happen with it, right? You can say all the things you want.
I recently had some work that someone bought show up in an auction, and which is fine with me, but the auction starting price was much lower than I sold it for originally. And I was like, this is like, what does this mean? Does this mean that people think the work is that much? It was confusing.
No, all of that stuff's changed. A friend that was trying to call me, she's had a experience with these people now that sell work they see at galleries and they start marking up the prices. And it's like, oh, okay, that's getting too weird for me, because as an artist, your prices, you're really careful about that. And you don't raise them and lower them on a whim. You're trying to, put food on the table and keep your career going, right? So yeah, it's strange. I've had things go up for auction, and yeah, I just sort of cringe and back away. It's like you never know what's going to happen. And I always, if somebody has an auction, I always tell them that the minimum would be the selling price, and if it can't sell for that price, then just give it back to me. It's fine. So and most people will do that.
So I recently interviewed yourself and Katrina Chater for the Ceramic Congress, which was really fun.
Yeah.
And I think we're eventually going to play that on the podcast feed as well. But I wanted to just ask about your teaching. We go in depth in that interview, but I wanted to talk about how Calgary, the environment of Calgary and the school gave you the opportunity to do the research, because you talked about your job like that you did research. It is research. So can you talk about how being the academic in that area helped you?
Yeah, it's interesting I taught for almost 30 years, and to watch all of that change over that period of time was quite interesting. There was a lot more freedom. I got my position in 1988, I think. And back then, artistic research, we weren't a university then, and artistic research was making your work. And some people, they would do that, but they didn't take it that seriously. And I always thought that research was making something, trying out some ideas, and then trying to refine them or connect them to other things. And I was always allowed to sort of pursue the areas that I wanted to go. Now that changes. There's a sort of an academic framework that things need to fit into. And I think people are trying to force things sometimes. There's a hierarchy in academia, and the universities, the big universities want all the money, and they'll piss on all the other people to keep them from getting it, right? So the artists are trying to be a little bit more like someone who is being a sociologist or something like that. And I think, there's a part of being an artist that I liked. It was always really cool about, you wake up in the morning and you think about something, and you can go out in the studio and make something about it. And it's not answering a bunch of questions or proving anything. It's very subjective. And I think if it stops being that way, it stops being interesting.
Part of that process is if people question me in the wrong part of my own process, I get confused. Like, it's helpful to make the object, then we'll talk about it, not the other way around.
Yeah. There's the experiential thing of, encountering an image or an object. And we are all different human beings. We all have a different acculturation. And I don't care what anybody says, if everything you ever saw in an art gallery or every pot you ever picked up, there's a little residue of that every time you encounter a new experience. So your takeaway is always and should always be different than mine. And I think there's this whole idea of getting, and it's really popular now with identity politics, that you're supposed to get my message. And that's only one kind of art. And I think that sort of thing will run its course. I think it's important, but I think that there's all kinds of things that are, less specific, more about individuals interpreting it on their own terms, rather than, more instruction than delight. And I think, my work's a balance of the two, and I always try to keep that. I'm not trying to hit you over the head with the concept, but I'm leading you in certain directions. And, you're going to think something. It might not be what I thought you would think, but you're probably going to get closer to what I was thinking than you would have if I, hadn't done that. So.
Well, this is actually a great segue to my last topic, and then we'll wrap it up, is how you feel when people write about your work. Because when someone is writing, they're putting their opinion or their understanding of work onto your work. But then when they write that in a catalog and someone like me reads it, in some ways, I also take on the writer's belief about your work.
Yeah, I know. And that's it's an interesting thing. And when I do an exhibition and there's going to be a catalog, I'm always quite interested to know who's going to write, or I like to suggest different voices because I think it's boring to have the same old thing written over and over again. So Diana Sherlock, who wrote the last one, knows me really, really well and knows my career. So, she obviously, and I trust her. It's not like I knew that there would be some new takes and it would be, it would be a good critical thing. Um, but my takeaway from all of that stuff is I really enjoy doing it with a professional because what they write helps me understand what I do a lot better than I did before. I don't always agree with everything they say, and that's perfectly fine. But sometimes, they open up new doors for me just by what they have to write and the way that they sort of perceived it. So I see it as a bit of a two-way process.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that because that's what my overall question is how often do writers write something that helps you have a breakthrough about your own work? Like, does that happen pretty much every show?
When there's a big, I've had a number of these institutional shows and when there's a catalog, and they shouldn't happen more than every 5 years or so, because it takes time for things to change, and you become flavor of the month for a while, and if everybody writes the same thing, it just dilutes it. So I'm usually think quite a lot about what people have written, and it does influence. I don't know if I can give you specific examples, but I know Mireille Perron wrote something for Studio Magazine, and it was like, wow, I never thought about that before. That's interesting. Well, so maybe I'll take this tack next time. So yeah, it's interesting. It also kind of I'm a potter. The potters won't have me, by the way. I can make pretty good pots. And that's actually all I've been doing in the pandemic. But they give me lots of interesting things. And, we had a really good, one of the things that made instruction at ACAD work when Katrina and I were there was it was a very collegial environment, particularly between the craft programs and the liberal studies programs. And we used to invite them to our critiques all the time. They would write, on our work, and it was a really nice mutual kind of thing. And it was really good that the students saw that. And it's interesting because a lot of the students, when you see them years later, they'll have gone to graduate school and things like that. And they go, boy, am I really glad that I had those liberal studies people, because they actually got what I do. They didn't just think that that's something you should be doing down in the basement, because these people had been involved in all of that stuff and they did really well in their studies after that. So I think that's really important. There's a danger of too much of that and students becoming self-conscious from overthinking what they do. But it's really good to have, serious critical thinkers from that angle, kind of engaging with you and your work and the students' work. I'm going to say something that'll make people mad again. People always talk about their students, and I never say they were my student. They were our student. There's a whole bunch of people that started them in grade 1 and they got to you in first year, and you might have only taught them 4 classes over 4 years. It's like, they're not your student. They're everybody's student that worked with them. And I think at ACAD, Katrina and I really we respected each other and worked that out. I'm sure she got mad at me a few times, but we always worked it out, and we always had the students' best interest at heart, and we wouldn't have arguments about what they should do in front of them. We would work that out and try to give them consistent advice, so they weren't, wondering, well, should I listen to him or should I listen to her? And I've seen so much of that happen too. So yeah, I think teaching is a really interesting thing to do. And I wouldn't have done it unless I got a lot back from it. And I did. The students gave me ideas too. And they can be brutally honest in their criticism too. Okay. So yeah, I really enjoyed that, but I don't have any desire to go back and do it anymore because it's just gotten very bureaucratic and it's kind of scary with COVID now. So
One thing you mentioned before is the hierarchies, and you've mentioned not liking hierarchies, like thinking that dualities are, you didn't say dangerous, but just like intellectually dualities are an end point. They're not a starting point. So do you think that it is in your personality to push against established norms? I don't want to make too broad of a connection, but you almost talk like an old punk rocker. Like if it's this way, I want to push it to be that way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, no one would ever call me a scrapper, but I had a big fight at ACAD. When I landed there, I'd just gone to school with Walter and the bunch in NASCAD, and I landed at ACAD, and craft was a dirty word. So, the crowning achievement that Katrina and I and the people there at the time got was we got the first MFA program at the college. We flipped that one around. And it did everybody good. Now the rest of the school doesn't think those people in the basement are just slinging mud. And, they're included with everybody else, and it's taken seriously. So that's an example of that. But that's long, and it's a slow process, and things take time to move, right?
The reason I asked is I find as I interview artists that this is a common thing, that having something to push against, whether that's a societal norm or an academic hierarchy, it's helpful. Like a lot of artists get creative juice from that. And it's not that you have to like walk around pissed off all the time. It's more just that it's the constant mental part of thinking it doesn't have to be like that. And you actually talked about it earlier, like the space in between, both in the daydreaming and thinking about how things could be, that's the space we live in.
Yeah. And I think to build on that, I'm one of these old-fashioned people who thinks that it all hasn't been done with visual art. I'm figuring out new things. And if I can figure out new things, other people can figure out new things. And the power of the images and objects in space is quite profound.
So I think to wrap it up, what do you have coming up? When will your next exhibition be?
You interviewed Paul Greenhouse on his new book, and he was president of NASCAD long after I was there, and we got to be friends because he came to the school a few times and things like that. And he curated a group of 4 Canadian artists to show in a couple of places in England with a very reputable gallery of London and Wiltshire called Messham's. And I'm going to be shipping some work off for a show there in November. And then in March next year, they have a 16th century barn for a gallery, and we're gonna do some larger installation works or something in that one. So that's the next one. And you know what? I'm probably not going to take any more because I burn myself out. And I only want to do the things I want to do. And I'm not trying to make $1 million or anything like that. So yeah, if it pays the expenses and I don't make a loss, then I'm usually happy about it. So this will be a nice opportunity. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you brought him up because I was looking through your CV and you have so many accolades, shows, everything. But one of the coolest things that I've seen about your work is that your picture is on the cover of his book. And somehow that was the coolest thing. And I'm like, should he write that in his CV? Because to me, I'm like, holy shit, he made the cover of the book.
Yeah. Fitting things into a CV is interesting too. The CV doesn't mention, I looked at it the other day, and it doesn't mention any of the travel that I've done to figure all this stuff out, because nobody wants like a 40-page CV. So I kind of kept it down to the basic stuff. But yeah, I don't pay much attention to my CV anymore. It's okay for now. But that thing on the book, that was like, okay, wow, this is pretty cool. I was pretty chuffed for that to happen. It's like, I never expected that to happen. And I think it actually is a pretty good choice. That's, it makes you think. So, and I hope the book's doing well. I think it's, it's probably in its second or third printing by now. So,
well, to wrap up, how can people see your work? Like, what is the best way for people to see it? Do you have a website? I can't remember. Did we talk about this before?
You know what? I don't get any tire kickers.
maybe Google. Let's just have people Google you. That'll probably be the
easiest. If you look up my name, there's everybody else has put stuff online, and that's good enough. I'm not, I'm not trying to sell things online. I usually only sell people if someone actually finds me and finds my email, and then I'll talk to them. But I'm not trying to. Again, I'm. You know what? My stuff sells for exorbitant prices, and I think there's a lot of young talent out there that needs exposure. So sometimes I just think I should pull back a bit and foster that sort of stuff, because it's a lot harder for them now than it was when I was their age. I think it's far more ubiquitous now. So,
well, thanks for taking the time to do this interview. It's good to see you again.
You're a good interviewer. We'll see ya.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
I'd like to thank Greg for taking the time to do this interview. It was a pleasure to chat with him again. Before we go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors. First, I'd like to thank Scut, who has been making equipment for potters since 1953. They're in their fourth generation of the family-owned business, and if you'd like to see the line of kilns that they currently have available, you can do that at scut.com. I'd also like to thank Poquoson Art School of Fine Craft. They are sponsoring today's show, as well as offering interactive online workshops and a 5-month spring residency. If you'd like more information on them, you can go to poquosonarts.org. Also wanted to remind you guys that I'm down at Penland teaching the fall concentration, so our next episode will be 2 weeks from now, so make sure to tune back in and check that out. As always, thanks for tuning in, and if you want to support the show, you can do that at talesofaredclayrambler.com/donate. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities whose lands we reside on in the United States, and recognize that we are uninvited guests on the occupied, unceded, and ancestral lands of over 500 nations indigenous to North America. By acknowledging and reflecting upon the contemporary lived experiences and histories of the Indigenous peoples here and globally, we may begin to take essential steps towards creating a more equitable world. Learn more through the #HonorNativeLand initiative of the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, and consider contributing to Indigenous-led organizations doing important work to further health and wellness, sovereignty, and self-determination of the first people of the lands you reside. This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.